Good morning, everyone, and welcome to CME Palooza Spring 2019. I am Scott Kober, one of the co-producers of CME Palooza, and I would like to welcome everyone to the first of our 8 sessions here today. We'll be running from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 8 one-hour sessions. You can watch any of these sessions live. Hopefully, lots of folks are watching this live, or you can certainly watch the recorded versions of these sessions as well. So I would like to welcome everyone to our first session of the day. This session is called, Can You Define and Articulate the Value of Your Education? This session is sponsored by Prova Education. Our moderator for today's session is LB Wang. LB is the director of the Lilly Grant Office. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. First of all, I would like to thank all of our sponsors of CME Palooza Spring, our gold sponsor, Academic CME, our silver sponsors, ASIM, Creative Educational Concepts, and Prova Education, and our bronze sponsors, Academy for Continued Healthcare Learning, Answers in CME, Catalyst Medical Education, Catamount Medical Education, Clinical Care Options, CMEology, the Global Academy for Medical Education, the Global Education Group, Helio.com Education Lab, Integritas Communications, Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, Primary Care Network, PBI, RMEI, Red Med Ed, Distal Editorial, and Vindigo Medical Education. So there are 3 ways to ask questions during this and all CME Palooza Spring questions. You can use the ASIM text line to send in a question. The number is 267-666-0CME, that's 0063. You can click on Google slide link found on the live page. Here's the link on this slide. It is also on the live page. Go under the Scott Sessions. Or you can tweet your question to us using the CME Palooza hashtag. And we'll get to as many questions as we can during this session. So certainly feel free to submit whatever you'd like. So a brief disclosure slide just to make everyone clear that the opinions, discussions, and or conclusions expressed during this session are those of our panelists and do not express an endorsement or a position of their employer, parent company, or affiliates. And with that, I am going to turn this over to LB to get the session started.
Thank you, and good morning, CME Paloozers. We are so happy you decided to start your day with us. We have an exciting topic today, so thank you for joining. Can you define and articulate the value of your education? Can you define and articulate the value of your education? Just pause and think about that for a moment. Do a little meditation this morning. Can you define the value of your education? And if you can define it, can you articulate it in a way that resonates with others, both internally, externally, various stakeholders? I'm LB from Lilly, and I am honored to be joined by a phenomenal group on my panel today, and I would like to introduce them. We have 2 individuals from the commercial supporter side today, and we have 3 representing the provider side. Maria Deutsch, who is the U.S. lead for IME at BMS. On the provider side, Dr. William Messia, who is the Vice President for Scientific Affairs at TOPEC, which is the Omnia Prova Education Collaborative. Wendy Cerenzia, who is the CEO of CE Outcomes, and Matt Fries, who is the General Manager of MedLearning Group. So welcome, panel, and again, thank you for such a collaborative preparation going into this very important topic. So I'm going to kick us off this morning with the question is, why is telling an impact and value story of our IME activities even important? Matt, I'm going to start with you.
Matt, go ahead.
Okay, maybe a little technical problems already. So actually, let's turn it over and we're going to start. Let's start with Maria first and we'll go back to Matt second. Maria, can you take that question?
Well, I think, Matt, did you just join?
I am. I'm back in if you can hear me.
Okay, go ahead.
So thank you, LB. Thank you, everybody listening, and to the panel. We had quite a number of planning calls around this, as it was an exciting topic. We're excited to be part of CME Palooza, and we thought this topic would be worthwhile to all the providers, the supporters, the stakeholders that take a part in our CME community. When we looked at this first piece around telling the impact story and why that's so important, kind of looked at it as two phases. I think as providers and as a CME community supporters, we're all invested in this from art around patient care and providing education to physicians and healthcare practitioners in order to provide them with the knowledge and tools to better care for their patients. So the end result is always the patient. I think part of that outcome story is so important and critical because we need to be able to share that and what that means and what we've been able to accomplish in our field. That's important for all the stakeholders, from associations, patient advocacy groups, all the different partners that we have. So part one of that impact story to me is important because we need to be able to share as a community what we're doing to benefit patient care. I think that's very critical. The other part of it directly relates, I think, to all the stakeholders involved in terms of our supporters. When we look at the funding and the investment that's being made in education, it's very significant. It's not to be taken for granted. I think part of what we need to be able to do in order to keep the funding coming in, but also express to the outside people that are not part of our community why it's so critical and why it's so important. And the only way to do that is to be able to tell your story and to be able to share the value of what you're doing. And we have a great panel that has talked about this in length in terms of why that's so critical and how to tell that story, because it's not just about putting together an outcomes report. It's about being succinct and being able to explain what you're trying to accomplish and the why. So that why is so critical. And when we look at the value story, I think it's important not only from our perspective as the provider, but also for the supporter to then be able to take back internally and share what's been accomplished with their stakeholders, because there's a huge value. These people have invested significant dollars in creating an opportunity for providers to design education that's going to make a large impact on the healthcare team. And we need to deliver for them that outcome so they can share it internally. So it all rolls downhill in terms of being able to create something of value, but also not just creating that value, but being able to tell your story. So many critical components. I think a lot of it has to do with providing that platform for success, but it begins with telling the story, I think, of patient care and why we're all in this together. And then providing that value is critical to keeping the industry and our community, to sustain it.
Maria?
Yeah, okay. So that was just to add on very little to what Matt had explained. We here at BMS, we have a challenge. It's one of our biggest challenges here is to show the value of IME. And we really lean heavily on the providers to help us create that story and to help us be able to explain to our internal stakeholders who trust us that we are supporting grants that align with our medical strategy. And we want to bring back to them the excellence in the education that we've supported, and finding a nice balance between getting that story across and showing the value is a challenge. We're trying to rise above that. We do a lot of different things here to show the value. We're going to be putting on a poster gallery day next week. We've invited everybody in the company. We have resource guides, so we're able to share our activities internally. We try to bring in innovative activities to show the company what we are engaging in. So each day seems to be, we get a step closer to really showing the real value of the IME we support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Matt and Maria. So just a little bit to add to that is that what we say a lot internally at Lilly is, we're talking about IME. We're not talking about philanthropy or donations or something like that. There's a place for that in corporations and it's there and we need that, but we're talking about independent medical education. So therefore, we must be able to share that story. We must be able to demonstrate. If we expect to get additional funding, we need to be able to articulate the value of that education. We need to be able to explain and use that for future decision making. So it's extremely important. And as Maria said, from the commercial supporter side, we really have to rely heavily on the providers and being able to help us. One thing I just want to mention to kick us off for the rest of the session too is for everybody on the line, we are all in this together. I mean, this is how we do education in the US, and we need to be in that collaborative effort, all within compliance and the way that we can, but we're in this together. And if we're not serving the customers that need the education and therefore then the patients. So they are counting on us. So it's really important. So thank you for kicking us off with that, those good responses to that first question. My next question is, beyond traditional pre and post test, how can providers better define educational outcomes in terms of the value of the education to the patient, the clinical learners, the provider, and the supporter? And I'm going to turn this question over to start with those on the provider side. So I'm going to start with William for this one.
All right, thank you, LB, and welcome everybody as well to CME Palooza. You know, this is an important question for us as providers because you hear very often the term start with the end in mind. But the reality is that you cannot tell a good value story unless you know what your end game will be for that particular activity. You may not know what the precise results are going to end up being, but you do have a sense for what your desired results are going to be. And once you have the knowledge of those desired results, then you can start to plan your activity accordingly. So you can build the educational goals that align to those end results. You can define your learning objectives, but more importantly then, as you're designing your educational interventions, then you can make those interventions appropriate to what it is that you're trying to achieve. So for example, LB mentioned in the question, pre-post tests. I mean, they're probably the most standard type of assessment measuring tool that we utilize in CME. But we need to use them effectively. So if we're dealing with a program where we want to increase a skill or improve a skill, you know, pre-post test, while it has the advantage of being able to take a snapshot in time in terms of what immediate knowledge or competency or performance skill may be occurring, it really is just that, a snapshot. There is no long-term assessment of what impact other variables may make on that individual. So are pre-post tests enough? Is that the only thing that we have as providers as a tool? And I think as a panel, we talked in our planning process that there are many other tools that we can utilize to tell a more profound story to get to that end that we desire. So for example, if we're talking about improving a skill, one way that we can go about it is by having skills tests. And those are specific types of testing tools or assessments that we can do at the end of any live or digital activity to really see whether or not those learners are applying what they have gained in terms of knowledge and competency into and translate that into that skill. And there are other types of assessments that we can utilize. It could be confidence-based questions. Are you correlating confidence with improvements in knowledge or competence? Are you segmenting your learners so that you can see what differences are occurring between the different types of learners, whether it be by profession or by location or by years in practice? You can segment it any way that you want. We need to start using our data in smarter ways because a pre-post exam can only tell so much of a story. And then, you know, other methods that we can utilize as providers outside of the standard could be in-person interviews or focus groups. So you can go one-on-one or have a focus group and discuss with your learners what impacts that education has, what changes are going to make in practice, and then reassess that over time. So it creates a stronger bond, a stronger relationship with your learners, and you're getting a wealth of quantitative and qualitative data that you can utilize in your reporting to help you tell that story.
Thank you. Matt?
I agree wholeheartedly with William's comments, and I think as a panel, going back to question one, and LB shared, we are all in this together, and we looked at this session as providing a call to action for providers to be able to build a better outcome story. And when we look at this question and we look at the pre and post and all the standard ways that we're measuring, we agree, I think, across this panel that really a pre and post is one small piece of the puzzle from a data perspective. There are so many different components that we need to be incorporating into our outcomes and being able to tell that story. So when we look at a programming or design, I think it's very important that in every program we design as CME providers, there's some type of tool or benefit to the physician and healthcare practitioner outside of the normal scope of just education. And we need to be able to measure on those tools, build on those tools, and really create that change and effect that we're all talking about. If we want to look at measuring patient health or change in behavior or any of the things that we deem important as part of our mission as providers, we need to move beyond just the pre and post and evaluation. We need to measure them longer term. We need to look at them from a tools perspective. We need to understand that there are many different variables, but we can still segment out CME as a very important piece of the puzzle to creating a better community of care. I think that concept is extremely important. So I think we do need to, as a provider group, move not even just a little, but way beyond just the pre and post test to measure a successful program and create a more advanced outcome that our supporters can go in front of their senior leadership and say, this is what's been done. It's not just a pre and post test. It's beyond that. That's one piece of a very intricate puzzle that each CME program should be made up of. And I think that's a call to action across the board for providers and supporters to be able to acknowledge that, measure that, and also be able to then speak to that.
So Wendy, I'm going to go to you too. You're in a very unique position to, provide advice from both sides, both the provider side and the commercial supporter side.
No, absolutely. And thank you, LB. One of the things that I've heard you say, Maria say, Matt in his introduction, all speaking to a story. So I think one of the key things here and in this discussion as we prepared for this and in today's session is really thinking about outcomes as part of the story. So as William said, having the end in mind, thinking about that as you're putting the program together. I think it is a challenge. Our company, particularly CE Outcomes, has always been primarily focused in higher level outcomes. But we also understand that some programs only have the ability to collect a pre and post test. I think one of the things we had discussed a little bit beyond all of the potential tools, and certainly this call to action that there is more to gather than just a pre and post test, is really thinking about how do you use those data sources that you have. So to William's point, you have this data. How do you look at that? How do you make that story? If all you have is a pre-post opportunity, maximize that opportunity. Look for ways to ask questions that can really reflect the story of your education. So instead of thinking about necessarily the mechanism, whether it's an interview or whether it's a pre-post, are the questions really going to reflect the story of the education? So I think that's one of the key things is really maximize what you have. And if you only have that pre-post test, you can still tell a very strong story if you have the right questions that reflect the objectives. So that's just another piece of the puzzle in terms of absolutely, I think we need to show more than a pre-post knowledge aspect of education. How is it impacting the physician in their practice? How is that impacting the patient? But from that knowledge perspective, if you're building upon knowledge as part of the key part of your program, then why is that important? Putting that into the clinical context of why that knowledge may be what is starting as a building block to potentially changing practice and impacting patients.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Wendy, on that note, then when is the right time to report outcomes? When is the right time to tell that story?
Another challenging issue. And certainly I think it's very dependent on the type of outcomes that you're gathering. Some of those higher level outcomes, following up to really understand performance, gathering patient health aspects of outcomes, that takes time. You need the education to take place. You need time in between your assessment. All of that can take time to get that data. However, I think, in prepping for this and in having some conversations, it really makes a difference depending on not only what type of outcomes, but also what is going on in the industry, clinical relevance of what's going on, changes within the clinical aspects. You have to think about keeping that time bound. So one of the things to consider is, yes, longer term outcomes may take time to gather, but are there pieces that can be reported in the meantime so that supporter has that story, has some pieces of the story to go back and tell internally while it's still relevant within the time frame of what they've supported?
Yeah, no, good response. I mean, from the commercial supporter side, I can say I don't have the answer either. I mean, we are still trying to figure that out because pieces of the story need to be told all along. So, but my quick answer to this one is what I do know is that what doesn't work, and I'll just use oncology as an example. So for all of you on the call, know the ever evolving change is going on in oncology. So to get an outcomes report a year and a half later, after a program has been done, it's not there's no story there to really tell by that time. Things have changed. Priorities may have changed internally. People have changed. So what are we wanting to show at that point in time? So there needs to be something that is, whatever word we want to use, interim or just updates or things along the way, if you want to help equip us to tell that story all along. So just something to think about, contemplate on, this is part of the story, is not waiting till the very end to tell something, especially in something like a science of oncology. So William, how would you respond to that?
Thank you, LB. I'll add to something that both of you have said. I mean, going back to something Wendy was saying about different time sets that are required for different types of assessments, I think it all comes back to setting expectations up front. So in your proposal, since you know exactly what types of measures or what types of assessments you're going to be doing, delineate that in the proposal and be clear to the supporter right up front that certain types of maybe performance level data may take 6 to 9 months before we start to gather any relevant information and be able to report on that. But knowledge base, we can do that earlier. So I think to your point as well, LB, just waiting till the end to get a report is not going to be enough, because by then the story is old and no one wants to hear it. So I think it comes down to consistency and really holding to your promise. And whatever you promise in that grant, stay true to your word. And I think that's what supporters need, is that level of consistency. So for example, we here at TOPEC, we develop reports 1 month after, 4 months after, and a year. That's our standard. And that's in all of our proposals. But each supporter may have their own unique requirements. And maybe it's level 1 and 2 every month. Or they might require quarterly in-depth reports. So we can adapt based on the needs of the supporter, but at least develop a consistent methodology so that supporters know what to expect from you.
Mm-hmm. Maria?
Yes, so to address some of the issues we've had here with regards to being able to report out on some of the live events quickly, we listened to what our internal stakeholders were asking, and we just implemented a new template asking for a media post live outcomes report, a very short type of template we created 3 to 5 days after the live event. Because like you said, LB, when there's a post brief after a meeting that most of our internal stakeholders attend, and they know that an IME event that we supported was going to be there, they want to know some information about the outcomes. And it's not only about the demographics and the numbers. We have some providers who actually supply us with the initial pre and post test questions, some of the educational impact that they're able to collect, some of the clinical pearls and testimonials. All of this type of information really goes a long way. It's not much. You already have it, and we ask for it, and many of the providers are very happy to give it to us because it makes the IME team here at BMS look good, and it makes the provider look good. And getting back to William's, how often his group shares outcomes, we actually have implemented a timeline of every 90 days post and online activity because we use that information. We create quarterly infographics on each individual tumor type where we can use the information that comes in our infographics. So it's very important to us, and I just want to thank everybody out there who tolerates and deals with our emails as to why, asking for this information, because it's not that it just sits in our computer file. We use the information. But I just wanted to also say, despite the fact that we do ask for these outcomes in a timeline, many times we have to reach out and ask for them. And if you just stuck to and looked at the LOA that we give out and we require, I don't want to have to reach out all the time. It seems like that's becoming more usual because once we give you the support, you think we're going to go away, but we're not. We're going to come back, we're going to find you, and we're going to ask you for those outcomes because we really need them and we use them.
Well, that's a good point, Maria. Is that, it goes back to me saying, we're all in this together, right? So if we want to help tell the story on your behalf, but we have several stories to tell at the same time. So the better you can help, the better you can provide something, again, that is digestible and usable, the more we can tell the story about IME. Very similar at Lilly, we similar to what you just said, Maria, we did the same thing about like a post live, 1 week symposium that we are now rolling out so that we can have something quick. We can share that quick because a lot of our internal stakeholders are attending those congresses, for example. So it's on their minds. They want to know. And we are continuing to work on, kind of the templated version of getting those outcomes so that we consistently tell a story across the board. So that's a great lead into this next question. And I'm going to start with you, Maria, from the supporter side, is it possible then to articulate the value of all these educational investments, not a tactic by tactic, but from kind of activity to impact story, by extracting outcomes from this variety of reporting styles? So I know some other supporters as well has tried to go down the template route and that type of thing, but is it possible to, with the variety of outcomes reports and the amount of grants that are supported, and all of them at different timelines and different reports and different page links and different formats, is it possible to tell a story in that way? What do you think, Maria?
So yet another challenge that we have here, hence the reason why we created a template for the provider to follow, because that's the type of information we're looking for. We're not telling them they have to use our template, but at least give us the information that we're looking for in that template, because this resonates with the medical teams that we join and we sit in on their meetings because we know what they're looking for. So, and with regards to all the information coming in, it is a challenge. We have managers that work with us here, and as I mentioned earlier in the question from before, we create quarterly infographics, meaning quarterly outcomes that we go through the outcomes that come in. We pull out some of the really interesting finds or really interesting educational closing of the gaps, or we still list the gaps and what has moved the clinicians' behavior. We'll pull these little pearls out and we'll put them into a report that we send out to our internal stakeholders. So we're always looking, we're always going through the outcomes. We're always, asking for fine tuning. It does take work on our part, but it's to help the patient ultimately, of course, and it's to show our value once again.
Mhm.
Hey,
Understood.
LB, I'm going to jump in with a couple of questions that have come in over the ASIM text line, probably for both Maria and LB. So the first one is just a comment, Maria. So this is, regarding your comment about kind of having to email supporters or providers. Resources are tight, and frequently there is an N of one person doing the outcomes. And with the demand for so many reports, even with scheduling, a reminder email from the grantor is extremely welcome and useful. So anyway, so
Thank you for that comment.
And so here's a question. Here's another question that came in over the ASIM text line. Okay, from a supportive perspective, how valuable is qualitative data from a focus group or interview? All too often, providers get told that the N values are small, so we hesitate to even report on such data. Do your internal stakeholders see value in it, or are you challenged to defend qualitative data with a low N?
Good question. Maria, start with you.
Yeah, so I'll get back to the first question about the N equals 1 resources. We actually have a system here that used to send out reminders. We're switching over to another one soon where we won't, those reminders won't fall through the cracks. So there have been some issues on our end, and when we send you an email, it's a reminder because our system didn't do it. And we understand about the N equals 1. A communication with us would be helpful. We do realize that the smaller academic centers don't gather that information that the bigger medical education companies do, but we will work with you. We will take what you have, and we understand. What was the second part of the question?
So I think the second question was about the value of qualitative interviews.
Oh, yes. So we do value the qualitative. We do. And I'm presenting to the team, and I give background as to why the numbers would be smaller, but maybe more valuable. So that works on our end. 20 people in a room getting really great feedback about information or about a particular activity with regards to outcomes does hold its weight as compared to 385 people in a room looking up at a stage at a national meeting. So both are good and both have their values, and we're willing to support both and to report out outcomes for both.
And Wendy, what's best practice there?
So I think just to, as Maria was saying, it really depends on the educational approach that's being used. So if, for example, you're putting on a series of small activities and you're not targeting this large N of 1,000 learners to begin with, that it's a very targeted initiative, particularly that's a great time to use more qualitative interviews to understand in more depth, how are they using the information? How are they putting into practice the education and the learnings that they have achieved from that activity? I think one of the challenges becomes, just to Maria's point, if there are 385 people in the room and then you're only able to get a sample of 5 of those people, it's a challenge. And it continues to be a huge challenge. We have seen drop-off rates in terms of follow-up and response rates on our surveys really impact us across about the last 5 years. So it continues to be something that clinicians are inundated, as we all are, with surveys for every activity in our lives. So certainly coming out of any educational activity, we going, okay, we'll fill out this survey, fill out one more thing. It's another part of their day that they don't have time for. So we have to think about the strategies that we can use to really maximize those response rates. But I think in terms of the qualitative versus quantitative, it really goes to the approach of the education, what makes sense as a tool in following up. So if you are in a bind and you need to go the qualitative route, certainly you can dig more, you can get more in-depth information. I think it's just a challenge if you do have a large audience and you're not able to get those response rates. Sometimes that may put you all in the position that it's harder to defend.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll just say that, one thing just that we all need to expect from each other is that when we're talking about outcomes, we need to show those outcomes with integrity. So whatever that story is what we need to talk about. And then you need to tell us with integrity. We need to be able to then articulate that as to the why, because there's a reality here. And so to the point of, we know that the busy HCP, and many of us in these industries are HCPs ourselves. And what I want to share with you is we've had a very robust 3-day session with global education colleagues around the world. And we've had several external speakers. And one speaker was talking about the title was The Modern Day HCP. And he's a physician himself. He showed his inbox as an example of like a 1-day example of something that he is balancing and things like that. And when I looked at it on the screen, I saw probably a lot of you in his inbox. And, just to show, it was just like a 1 day and it was huge. And it was go to this CME event or take this survey and everything like that. And it was just a snapshot that made me realize, what does he do with that? So we get it and we understand. And so we got to pull again together about what story then are we trying to tell? What's reality? What do we tell with the data we have, but with integrity? So with that, let's go to, I want to talk about a term and see how many of you have heard it. Feel free to send questions or even just your comments in about this. How do you feel about this? Return on educational investment or return on education. So we by all means are not talking ROI. We can't, we should not. But again, we're not also talking philanthropy. We're not talking, charitable donation. We are talking about IME. And so we do expect to have, in order to tell a story, it is a return on that educational investment. So that's a term I've been using a lot. It resonates a lot with people once I can tell them why we can measure how we're allowed to do that in the medical affairs space. I can tell you that it gets a lot of attention and people are starting to use that and they like it. I don't know how long it's been around, to be honest, but I want to know how everyone feels about this. So from let's start, Matt, from the provider side. How do you feel about that term?
So we've talked about this term, LB, and I've heard you use it many times. I also hear it from more and more from other supporters as well. And I think it's been around, it's come in and out. I think the context around it is very important. You framed it as not return on investment, but return on educational investment. I think as providers, we can't be scared of this term. This is what we need to do. We have on this panel, Maria and LB, both representing large granting organizations. And they're telling us with passion that they need to be able to go and stand up in front of their stakeholders, their team that's helping them get budget, and they need to say why and what has been successful. They're telling us directly right now on this event, but they're telling us in meetings as we go forward. And I've heard that not just from the two of them, but from other supporters as well, more and more this year and the past year than ever before. And I think, again, going back to the call of action, going back to the point of we're providers, this is what we do. Why would we be afraid to provide significant measurement data to help them demonstrate the successes of our industry? So I love the term. I think it's something that we all need to embrace. I think as a community, we need to do better. I think we need to continue to strive to create a platform that shows exactly what the educational investment was and what happened and what that, going back to Wendy, tied it really well together in terms of that story. So to me, I love the term. I think as providers, we need to embrace it. I think we need to provide our supporters with as much data, but in a story fashion that's not 150 slides, something that summarizes what's been accomplished so they can do the elevator pitch when they're talking to their senior leadership. Because more and more I hear from people, you know what, these are great, but I get about 5 minutes, maybe 2 slides in the room to tell these people what we've accomplished. So I can't really go through all of that data and tell that story without it kind of being summarized. So I think that's a key role of the provider, is helping them tell that story. Reach out and ask if there's assistance you can do with slides, with graphics, with any piece of the component, because at the end of the day, we live and breathe these programs, and they have hundreds that they've supported. So I think we need to embrace the piece of it, but we also need to help them. We need to support them in telling the story, but providing them with different tools, different ways to discuss it, different graphics. So for me, again, going back to that whole call of action, going back to we're in this together, we truly are in this together. As we're providing them outcomes, they're taking those outcomes and providing it to somebody else. We need to work together upstream to continue to embrace what we're all trying to accomplish. So it's a passionate one for, I think, everyone on this panel. And I think it's important that we all see the value in what we're trying to achieve.
I'd just like to thank you, Matt. I'd like to add to that. I think what a very important component here that hasn't been mentioned yet is the investment that a provider should make with regard to their outcomes team. Sometimes they don't have the right people in place. Sometimes they don't have people in place at all. And we're relying heavily on this piece of the grant that we're looking at, and it looks very good as to the types of outcomes we're going to get, just for it to finally, it comes to fruition where you fall short. And I've had that happen to me too many times, and we'll make a phone call and they don't have the right people in place, or they don't know how to measure that success. But in the grant, it looks really good, like you know how to measure it, but in reality, it doesn't. So when that happens, that always gives me pause, because the next time I see that grant come in, I'm going to remember what happened the last time, because of the energy put into the review, the energy put into the grant, the energy of spending our budget money, and I don't get what I'm promised. That kind of sets up for failure in the future. And if there's any way that before you put in a grant, the true expectations, or what you're really going to get, what we're going to get out of it, that would really be helpful.
Good point. Scott, are there any questions or comments that have come through?
I think the questions and comments that have recently come through, you guys have already covered them. So
Okay.
I think
Yeah.
we're okay.
Okay,
So-
quick, yeah, go ahead, William. Quick rapid fire with William and Wendy. I want to hear your thoughts on ROEI.
Yeah, so I'd like to add to something that Matt was saying earlier about how to tell the story, because I think that's very important. Matt, you were mentioning that this is not a 150-page document. The reality is that you should begin to articulate your story at the grant level. And I think, Maria, that's going to help address some of the concerns that as supporters you may have in being able to identify whether or not the provider has an understanding of what they're trying to achieve and how they're going to achieve it through the program. So it might provide a little bit of a sense of security on the supporter side that we can articulate our story from the very beginning. But when we're building that story, to be able to articulate that return on educational investment, I want to get a little practical here. How do we do that? And I think part of the way that we have to do that is by asking ourselves some questions. And we need to be able to answer those questions and articulate them in 2 or 3 sentences. This is not War and Peace, so it's not about length. And this is not
True.
Wuthering Heights, so it's not about offering detail after detail after detail. This is being concise on the value of the education. So what are those questions that you ask yourself? What are the 1 or 2 things that you want to achieve through this program? What are the gaps that support or that provide the evidence for those 1 or 2 things that you want to achieve in that program? What's the clinical significance of those gaps? Because those gaps are not just there as gaps. They actually have an impact on either a patient or a healthcare system or a process. So what is the significance of that gap? And then how are you going to put together an intervention that can close that gap? How are you going to measure it? And then what does your gain mean in terms of improvements in patient care or improvement at the systems level, whatever the program was going through. So being able to articulate answers to those questions in a short and concise way gives us that elevator speech that Matt was referring to, again, in 2 or 3 sentences or 1 or 2 slides.
And I couldn't agree more, William, with what you're saying. I think it's really focusing on what is critical, what's the clinical impact, what was that education intending to do, how well did it achieve that goal, how can you do that in a concise way. I think all of this is challenging, though. I think to recognize the point of some of these outcomes departments are one person. Maria, to your point, it sounds great in a grant that somebody may have articulated what they intended to do, and that kind of gets shuffled off to one person to figure out how to tell that story. I think that's the key here to telling the story, is really integrating. Outcomes aren't an afterthought. It's not something that you should slap together a report at the end. It really takes that whole team to understand that this is part of the education. And if you can't tell that story, if you can't demonstrate that clearly, concisely, in a short presentation of really what's most relevant, you've lost a huge opportunity to continue to demonstrate how well your education is making a difference. So I think it is a huge challenge. I think it is a team effort, and it really does begin at the beginning and needs to carry through the whole process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No question. I mean, I think we've kind of got to our last few questions just about, upfront, how do you even build in better into a grant up front to help articulate what story you may be wanting to tell at the end, with the end in mind, as we've already said. So going back to, we're in this together, but so I'll kind of say it a different way, is how can the providers help the IME committees see the potential through that grant of what they're trying to articulate? So we want to let you know that we respect the challenge that you have of trying to put something into a proposal and make that message come out clear when it's being reviewed. So it's challenging. We know it's challenging on our side because we review hundreds and hundreds of grants. So how do you do that? So from the provider side, I'm going to start with William. How kind of continue on what you were saying, but how do you build it better in the grant up front that can come through when we're reviewing those proposals with our committees internally?
Yeah, I'll just build on what I was saying earlier. I think if you can articulate in the grant the questions that you were asking yourself, if you can articulate why you wanted to do this education, and then build around that to be able to say what were the steps that you are intending to do in order to be able to fulfill on that promise that you're making that grant, I think that by doing that, you're being able to articulate to the supporter that you are going to demonstrate a value at the end of this activity, that you have had that foresight at the planning stage, at the very early planning stage, to know what it is at the end that you want to tell. And I'll add something too. I think we're all doing this education for a reason, and I don't think that reason is just to get a grant. I think that there's a passion to the work that we do. And I do believe that in that grant, we can allow that passion to come through and show the supporters that why we're doing this is because we want to have a meaningful impact. And I think if we allow that passion to come through, that gives the supporter even a greater sense of security and knowing that we're going to follow through on our promise.
Matt?
I agree with William, and I really liked the way he framed earlier about asking yourself the question about what you're trying to achieve within your program. LB, we had a conversation the other day around education and around the idea of what comes first. So for me, when we're designing a grant, every time we design a grant, a proposal, from gap analysis all the way through the design and the outcome, always we start with, well, what is this going to do for the patient? At the end of all this education, what's been achieved, the increase in knowledge, competence, change, whatever it is we're going after, what is that end result for the patient? And I think if as a community we continue to keep that in mind at the start, we can design and frame our proposals with the passion that William's talking about, because at the end of the day, that's really what we're all doing. That's why we're creating it. And then I think it goes back to something Maria said earlier about keeping your promises. As you frame this, it's not just about writing it and being a good storyteller in your proposal. You need to back these things up. You need to put the investment in the departments that are important within your organization. And outcomes is a critical piece of that. and it's becoming more and more. And if you think of it as an investment in an investment, right? You're not going to be able to provide and show the value without the right people in your organization. So if you think of it from, if you need to go back and think of it just on financial terms, your outcomes people are an investment. They're an investment in your future, the future of CME, all the stakeholders that go on. So attaching this to the right people and getting it right from the beginning in your program design all the way through is a very critical piece to the story, and framing that up for our supporters so that they understand that within the proposal, and then see you carrying it through with the interim outcomes that you provide along the way. I think this all really ties well together. And I know as a panel, we tried to develop questions that told a story throughout. And hopefully you're seeing both sides of the provider and the supporter and how we really are all in this together. And it's about pulling it together front to back. So it starts in the grant request, all the way through execution, all the way through completion.
So LB, there's another question that just came over on the ASIM text line, just to kind of throw out quickly to you and Marie. I know we've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to summarize this here. So for the supporters, so the two of you, do you ever get any comments or questions from compliance or legal related to any outcomes or questions in a pre or post test that are specific to one or more of the drugs that you guys manufacture?
Good question, Maria.
Yeah, no, we don't get any pushback. Legal kind of they review the grant at the very beginning. They encourage the outcomes, or they encourage us to use the outcomes internally as we see fit. What we have, though, noticed is that a lot of the questions, because the questions are based on the learning objectives, and if our drug is part of the education, which, fair, balanced, medically accurate, and it happens to be used in a question, that's fine, because we expect other drugs to be used in other questions as well. So when we evaluate the activities, we are looking to make sure it's fair, balanced, because we don't want legal to come back to us. And if it's not fair, balanced, I've had plenty of conversations with providers over the time I've been here. So we kind of mitigate that. But going back to how to build a better grant, because I just want to make sure that I'm able to state this, because we see this quite often, and this is a great platform to share that with. We just want to make sure that when you're submitting a grant, you know the science. We can see right through if you guys don't know the science. We'd like to see a needs assessment, a gap analysis that is well done, that you're triangulating your resources, because we don't see many times a robust needs assessment. And when you ask, why didn't you choose my grant, is because some other grants come in and the needs assessments and gap analysis are so much more robust. And I just want to put out there, please be realistic with the number of learners that you're looking to achieve, and the types of target audiences, because I'll get back outcomes where you fall so short. You're promising this number and you get such a lower number, and I'm basing my whole support on 4, 5, 6 pages in a grant, and I'm trusting that number or that target audience is going to be reached. So we have to make sure that we're on the same playing field, and that you're just being realistic with us. I just needed to put that out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, real quick. I know we just have a few more minutes. So for the question from Leo, no, we don't either get any questions. I mean, I think they trust us through the process. We do vote on the grants that we review on whether there is fair and balanced. So we feel like we have all of those pieces embedded both in the beginning and the end. So Scott, any more questions before I try to wrap us up?
No more questions. Yeah, so you've got about 45 seconds.
Here we go. So, okay, 45 seconds of, guys, if we're not going to use the outcomes. If we can't use the outcomes, we should not be funding outcomes. So, we need to get better at if you're going to send us a report late and we don't have anything to do with it, but we funded again, it's not helping either of us. So it's really important that we realize again that we want to help tell the story. So for the providers there, we respect so much of what you do and what you put in and the effort. We want to be able to use it. So help us use it. But oftentimes we're aggregating data, remember. So sometimes we're not just talking about a one grant, we're talking about a magnitude of grants together in the area of one disease state. So we need to be able to help us tell that value and impact story. And just to end, I mentioned that we've had a huge big meeting this last few days with global colleagues from around the world with some of our very senior leadership at Lilly across medical affairs. And I can tell you how many times we've been talking about education when the question about, well, what is that story? Tell me about the story that you have. What are you doing in order to help impact patient care? What does that look like? And so I can tell you it's not just us at the grant by grant level or with our committees. We want to tell that story across our organizations, and we need to be in this together. We need to help each other. This is what we do. We're passionate about it. And again, just thank you for your time and for the questions that came in, and just to an amazing panel from both the provider and supporter side. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, LB, and thank you so much to Maria and Matt kind of jumping in and out, and Wendy and to William. So speaking about outcomes, there is a brief survey that we have on the CME Palooza site. We are not reporting our outcomes to any supporters, but this does help us plan future events. So for those folks watching the session, either live or the recorded version, there is a survey link at the top of the live tab that is very brief that helps us plan for the future. And so with that, for those folks who are viewing this live, to do the next session, you will need to refresh your browser after this session is over, and our next session will start at the top of the hour. So thank you once again to our panelists, and thank you once again to everybody who watched and asked questions, and we will see you in a few minutes.
Bye.